Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
Welcome. My special guest is Bonnie Harrison, a renowned licensed New York City-based psychotherapist who works with cross-cultural groups. She is an educator, trainer, and writer, and has lectured and taught at various universities and colleges in and out of New York State. She has published articles and lectured on relationships, women, healing and spirituality, HIV/AIDS, wellness, and recovery. She also functions as an organizational consultant and incorporates many of the techniques and principles she learned while traveling and studying throughout Africa and the Caribbean. Her colleagues have described her work as eclectic, Africa-centered, culturally relevant, and competent. Her graduate and postgraduate studies in human services, counseling, and community psychology helped prepare her for the challenges inherent in working with people of African descent, using non-traditional models of service delivery in a dominant culture system medical model construct. Professor Harrison is also the founder of the Women's Institute for Training and Support Services, Inc., a women-centered human services organization, and Black Grits, Coconut Water, and Salsa, an international women writers collective. Members of this group take part in live stage, radio, and television performances based on readings from her soon-to-be-published book, Mommie Letters. The book, which is part of a journaling process that was designed by Professor Harrison for members of her women's self-development group, features letters from the women to their mothers and chronicles their lives as little girls, adolescents, and maturing women. The book provides a passionate, poignant, and powerful examination of their journey toward self-empowerment and healing. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the show, Professor Harrison.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure being here. I'm looking forward to us having this conversation. I really am. So thank you for inviting me to be on your show.
Mommie Letters and Women, Healing the Broken Relationship. Can you provide a historical perspective on this?
Mommie Letters, number one, is the name of not only a soon-to-be-published book, it also is the name of a spoken word series that resulted from the readings of letters that the women in a support group that I run had written. In my work, I use a technique called journaling, and it's a very powerful technique. And women were able to, including myself, write letters to our mothers, letters that spoke to things that we hadn't talked about, or maybe we had talked about. But these letters were written for the purpose of healing and uncovering a lot of the things that women had either suppressed, didn't remember, didn't want to talk about, were ashamed of, or were enraged by. That rage, that shame, all of those disguises of rage were primarily part of the reason they were in my office, part of the reason that they came for clinical intervention, part of the reason their relationships did not work. Part of the reason that their relationships did not work with either in their intimate relationships or relationships with their children, but the relationship they had with themselves did not work.
So in terms of the journaling, this wasn't something that they were already engaged in. It was something that you invited them to or encouraged them to do?
Yes. It's a part of the process that I use in my practice. Journaling is an extension of what is very common among people of African descent. It's an extension of this whole conversation that we have. We are very oral people. So our history is oral. That's one of the reasons other people have been able to rewrite our history and distort it, because in certain cases there was nothing written. Historically, our history was passed on from father to son and mother to daughter, and our history was a oral history. So unless people could read hieroglyphs or they could read the symbols and signs in caves, they didn't understand our history unless it was being repeated. So very often when you talk about something, you will also put that something in a form that can be referred to at a later date. So while the language that we look at as English and the script that we use was not what was used during the earlier periods of our history. There were other ways that we did record our history. And we had instruments, too, to tell the story, the drums, for example, in our dance. So our stories were told in ways that in some cultures was not prominent. So I recognized that in order for me to be effective in the work that I do, it had to be Africa-centric. It had to be Africa-centered. That meant having conversations, and journaling was central to people being able to unleash a lot of feelings and a lot of memories in a safe environment that were hidden and that were forgotten and that were just not talked about, particularly memories that had to do with their relationship with their mothers. One of the things I have discovered throughout my years and years of work, it didn't matter who I was working with, men, it could be women, and it didn't have to be just people of African descent. This goes across every cultural group, every ethnic group. Mothers are always central to our stories. So it became important for me to have women talk about their relationships with their mothers. And it wasn't an easy task because we have been conditioned to see mother as sacrosanct. So we don't want to say anything bad about mommy, even when mommy sometimes was monstrous in some of our lives. Some of the women had some horrific experiences with their mothers. And I also was charged with the task of helping women come to grips with their woundedness, their pain, and at the same time helping them understand the genesis of that pain and helping them understand how, while we are not going to pretend that mommy didn't do or did what she did the way she did or didn't do it, and that had a very serious and harmful impact on women's lives, it was also important for women to have a historical understanding of how all this came to be, because mothers didn't just end up being neglectful and hurtful. I also knew that my work would need to entail an educational process. So I think that's one of the reasons that my work has been successful the way it has been, because it not only is it educational, but it's educational from a historical perspective. So one of the things that I had to introduce people to was a totally different way of looking at our pain, a totally different way of looking at the way our mothers behaved, that we had rights to be angry, to feel angry. We had a right to feel enraged. What I also had to teach women was that rage has many disguises, and it doesn't just show up as rage. It shows up as in the form of alcoholism. It shows up in the form of self-hatred. It shows up in the form of all kinds of self-destructive things we do, substance abuses across the board. It shows up in the way we do relationships, particularly relationships that are serial as well as destructive. It shows up in the way we even decide to have children. So many women have children not because they really want to have children, but because they feel obligated. Their mothers and their fathers want grandchildren, or they feel less than a woman if they are the one among their friends that doesn't have children. But psychologically and psychically and emotionally, more often than not, they are not prepared, nor financially prepared to take care of children adequately. So a lot of these rage disguises get played out in our lives in a way that really interfere with our relationship with others as well as our relationship with ourselves. And so healing the broken relationship became the thesis of my work. I recognize that nothing is going to work for us as women, and nothing is going to work for us as a people until we're able to heal our broken relationship. And our most primary relationship that was broken outside that with ourselves was the relationship we had with the African continent. So when you think about white supremacy, and that's part of my conversation, there's no way I can have an intelligent conversation and not have at least the understanding that white supremacy has a role in everything that impacts us as a people and others as a people. So when I look at how it impacted us as a people, I recognize that, for example, our introduction to this hemisphere was an introduction that came about as a result of slavery being an economic system. It's a socio-political economic system that is one arm of white supremacy. And then you have the educational system, you have your religious systems, you have your healthcare systems, your penal justice systems. You have all of these systems that are a part of this political octopus. And those systems keep in place the ideology and the mechanisms. They are the mechanisms by which this machine runs. And so in the process of creating an economic system, we became the commodity. Our experience in the U.S. was different from the slave experience of people of African descent in other parts of the world. I don't want to turn this into a slavery history lesson.
I understand.
But it was different, and that's one of the things that I talk about when I do lectures. And it was different in the way that impacted women, black African American women. People ask me, why do you say black African American? Well, because you can be African American and don't have to be black. So it's important for me to distinguish, to make those distinctions. But black African American women, when I look at our history and the impact slavery had on us as a people, as a group, it begins to make sense, on the one hand, why mothers behave the way they do with their children when the way they behave is dysfunctional. And when I think about our great-great-grandmothers and our great-grandmothers and our grandmothers who were coming out of a slavery experience, who they say that, our stories begin at home and children live what they learn, or they learn what they live. So I remember my father talking to me about how, when he was a child, how his father used to beat him. And my father's father was the son of an ex-slave. And he treated his children the way he was treated. So my father talked to me about how his father would tie him to a tree and beat him and then rub salt in the wounds. It's archaic and it's barbaric, but that's what his father learned to do. So when my father would beat us, he never thought about where he would hit us or how it would hurt or if it would tear the skin. He just repeated what he had experienced. So when I see mothers in the street yelling at their children and hitting them and denigrating their children, I recognize that that behavior is a learned behavior, and that behavior is a behavior that can be traced right back to slavery. And the way mothers, out of love for their children, treated their children on the plantations such that they wouldn't end up being a child that massa would want to sell. So it was not uncommon for mothers to mangle their children's feet and hands, because then nobody wants to buy a child who has a mangled foot or hand. When mothers began to notice that the slave holders were paying attention to their daughters or their sons, because sons were no more immune to pedophilia and to rape than were daughters. When she noticed that there was this attention being paid to her child, she would begin to denigrate them. Oh, you don't want her, massa, she's so ugly and lazy. He's so lazy. And then she would hit the child and tell him, get on out of here. That was her way of protecting her child. Now, the children could hear this. So when you're being told how ugly you are, how lazy you are, how no good you are, how shiftless you are, at some level, that information doesn't go away.
It becomes
stays
processed.
there. Absolutely. So I talk about something called ancestral inheritance. And my contention is that, and there's documentation to verify what I'm saying. This isn't something that I just came up with on my own, even though I put a different spin on it, because the paradigm that I'm teaching is one that teaches us that ancestral inheritance is also a piece of the puzzle that we need to address in order for us to understand the need to heal our broken relationships. And my contention is that just like hair color, eyes, the shape of bodies, our height, our body type, all of this information is stored in our DNA. Well, I contend that so are memories, so are emotions stored in our DNA. So when you think about Africans who were minding their own business in villages, all of a sudden being snatched out of those villages, no warning, just snatched away, brutalized, taken someplace, kept in tombs, actually. You know, I remember when my first trip to Africa, and I went to Elmina Castle it was called. And when I stepped inside the slave fort, I mean, the emotion that came over me was so profound, it almost took me to my knees. There's a smell in that place that I'll never get out of my brain, because the spirit of all of our ancestors that came through those doors and went out the back door is still in there. The ground is uneven, and we discovered later that unevenness is not dirt. That's from feces and bodies that were packed on top of each other, and over time it just became hardened, and it's still there. But the point I'm making is that once we went through the myriad of emotions that you go through when you're traumatized, because that was an absolutely traumatizing experience, the realization, once we got to that door of no return, that we were never going to be able to come back, was compounded once we got out to sea and looked back in casino land. And for months and months, we sailed on waters and was stuffed into quarters where there was only 18 inches between us and the next body, be it dead or alive. That type of trauma, those memories were deeply imprinted into the DNA of our ancestors. So those that lived, and we are the children of the children of the children that just did not die. We would not die. We are just the best of the best of the best that was left. However, surviving all of that and then getting here, for example, I recognize the ship stopped all over the place, but let's just talk about America. Getting here and then having to go through the trauma of the slavery experience on the plantations. Those memories were inextricably imprinted in our DNA. And so through intergenerational child rearing practices, those memories and those behaviors that were associated with that slavery experience just kept getting transmitted and transmitted generation after generation after generation. And the need to continue to behave that way was supported by the oppressive system that we live in. Oppression and prejudice and all of the things that Black African Americans still experience until today support those feelings and those memories, which for the most part are unconscious. But when you see people mistreating each other, mistreating people that look just like themselves, treating each other as though they hate each other, there's no logical reason for that. There's no sane reason for that behavior. There has to be a logical explanation. And the logical explanation has to do, I think, with it's two-part, but part of it has to do with ancestral inheritance. The other part has to do with the system that we continue to live in, white supremacy, and all of the other systems that support that way of being. So we were able to physically survive it all, but the damage it did to us psychically, the relationship that was broken between us and the continent, the relationship that was broken between us and our parents, our friends, our children, and what it did to us, the relationship that was broken between us and ourself, has to be repaired. That relationship has to be healed. Until we do that healing work, we will continue to dysfunction as a group. Now, it doesn't mean that there are not individuals of us in society that have not overcome and that become conscious and have done some healing work. But as a group, we still are carrying this ancestral inheritance. And we are not even aware that the way we behave, sometimes have you ever heard yourself say, I don't know why I did that. What made me do that? Yeah, you don't know why you did it. But I do contend that our ancestors will not let us rest. And they can't rest until we heal those wounds. So the work that I do is designed to bring about healing. And it's done through us telling our stories and writing about it. And then what we did with Mommie Letters is we then were able to do spoken word performances, because so much of what has happened to us is shameful. We feel ashamed. And you feel shame when you think you've done something wrong. For example, I remember a time in my life when I used to watch the behavior of other black people and feel profoundly ashamed. Why did I feel ashamed? Because that person was a reflection of and a representative of me. So it was almost as though I was doing it, and I felt ashamed. So we have to heal the shame, which is part of the rage disguise. We have to heal these wounds. It doesn't mean that these feelings and memories are going to go away, but what it does mean is doing this work that I've designed is called uncovering. It allows you to bring those memories to your conscious mind. And because once you're aware of it, you can do something about it. If you're not aware of it, it will continue to drive your behavior, and you will continue to dysfunction and sabotage yourself out of existence.
In terms of ancestral inheritance, we're basically speaking from a black perspective. But is it safe to say, or is it logical to assume that whites, particularly the wives of the plantation owners or the slave masters, also fell victim to this because of what they witnessed in terms of the brutality that was practiced upon the slaves? So is it fair to say that they too have suffered to an extent, and maybe even to an even greater extent, because they had to witness what was going on but couldn't say anything?
Well, I think that ancestral inheritance is something that all groups of people experience and have, that experience of ancestral inheritance of emotions and memory. The white woman's experience of slavery is absolutely diametrically opposed to ours, in the sense that, on the one hand, yes, she witnessed her husband sleeping with the slave girls and women, and she took out her anger and rage on us because she couldn't take it out on him. What we have to understand is, even though she knew that her husband, for example, was raping these young girls and these women, in order for her to continue to keep her ego intact, she couldn't blame him. It was our fault. So the economic system of slavery that existed, particularly in the South, pre and post-Civil War, was a system that could not have very easily been maintained without the support of the white woman. The mistress of the household made sure that that economic system survived because she had control over the women and the men on that plantation when her husband was not there. When they went off to war, for example, she controlled that plantation. And she controlled it sometimes in ways that were more vicious than the ways the men did when it came to black women. And then white women had a reputation to uphold. They had to, number one, look like and behave like ladies, and they had to live up to, on the surface, this image of gentility. So they were these genteel ladies on the outside. But each one of those white women that were the mistresses over plantations knew that in the household there was a way that they treated those enslaved African women. We can look at all the slave narratives that exist. There's not a story that I've ever read where any African enslaved woman talked about how wonderful mistress was to her. They talk about how horrific life was under the demeaning and the vicious beatings and maimings and killings that were done at the hands of white women. That's why the whole issue of feminism is one that I do not embrace, because feminism arose out of white women's need to have equality when it came to their men and social status. For us, we wanted to stay alive, and we wanted our men to stay alive. So the situation between black men and black women was different from the situation between white women and white men. Their issue and struggle around economic parity, what does that say when economics were derived from the free labor and our backs? So when you look at the inheritance of white women today and their children, this inheritance resulted from the free labor and the maimings and the killings and the dehumanization that went on at the hands of white women as well as white men when it came to black women and black men. So that whole issue of white women being impacted by the slavery experience, yes, they were. But they had power that we didn't have. They never were reduced to the status of slave. They were always mistress, no matter how poor they were. They were still white ladies. And black women were never viewed as ladies. We were never viewed as genteel. We were viewed as strong workhorses. And some of us were worked to death. I mean, physically worked to death. So what I can say, however, is that there's a schizophrenic kind of relationship that goes on between black women and white women. Because what you also had happening during slavery was, while white women were brutalizing black women as a group, now there were always one or two here and there, just like there's always an exception to every situation. There were some exceptions, but the exception did never mean that white women were on par with black women or black women could ever be on par with white women, because we were enslaved and we had a place. But the dichotomy that existed between these two realities was that while we were being abused and treated less than, we were also suckling their babies. We were also the reasons that their babies, because there were times that there might not have been food. Some of those plantations after the war, they were dirt poor. And those white women ended up having to go to work after the war. During the industrial period and post-industrial period, from the plantation, white women ended up having to get jobs. And they became workers. They were no longer able to tell us what to do. We also became workers. So the transition from I am the mistress of this household and this plantation to I am now a worker for somebody else was very difficult for white women. But for us, it was a step up. We never had parity with them in terms of equal pay for equal work. That never happened. But white women, that was their main thing. They wanted equal work for equal pay.
And all this continues to have a carryover effect in terms of what you're putting together with the Mommie letters and the women addressing the issues that they're dealing with today.
Well, it has to. There's no way. You see, sadly, white women, like black women, are not conscious as a group of ancestral inheritance of rage. They're not conscious of the ancestral inheritance of all of those other memories and experiences. That's one of the reasons I could never, for example, ever have a white lover. I could never marry a white man, because no matter how wonderful this individual would be, there's a piece of my history that's inextricably tied to his DNA that he might not be aware of, but it informs how he, at some point in history, will relate to me. And there's no way I will ever forget those experiences of my people. And when I look at interracial couples, there's always a power dynamic that you're going to find in those couples. And generally, Somebody has power in the bedroom, and it's generally the black woman or the black man, and somebody has power in the boardroom, and that's generally the white woman or the white man. And that's just too reminiscent of slavery for me. There just will not be an equality of relationship, as far as I'm concerned, until healing has been done. And until this system that we live in, this white supremacist system, is, which it never will be, redesigned in such a way that black people are going to have equality and be able to have as a group the same benefits that whites have, because there's no way they can ever catch up. The 500 years of free labor that this one group of people were able to have in order to amass the fortunes that they have amassed. Even with the idea of reparations, this country has not yet addressed the issue as did Sweden, as did other nations. They addressed reparations for Jews and for others, that they were inhumane and treated inhumanely. But America has never taken ownership for the absolute horror that we were subjected to and still are as a people. So there's been no reconciliation on the level that I'm talking about that would allow any black or white relationship to be healthy, as far as I'm concerned. No matter how well intended both individuals might be. You don't find any clinical systems that are designed out there to heal the broken relationship that exists between blacks and whites that came out of the slavery experience. And until that's addressed and dealt with, the post-traumatic slave syndrome will persist, and the disorder will persist, and we will continue to dysfunction as a group. So when people say, well, why don't we get together, and why can't we do this, that, and the other? You can't answer complicated situations with simple answers. When I look at other people that come to this country and they're able to surpass what we have been able to accomplish here of late, number one, they come here as immigrants. And as immigrants, they have a certain status. There are programs for immigrants. Russian Jews come to this country, there are programs set up for them. For example, there are programs set up for people that are not native. There are none set up for us. We were not immigrants. We were enslaved and forced to come here. We are the only group of people that are here against our will. Everyone else that's in America came looking for a better way of life, and they have found a better way of life at some level. Native people and black African Americans, our story is different. And the wounds are so deep, and the conversations are so glossed over and kept at a level that doesn't deal with what I'm talking about. People talk about ancestral inheritance, and they talk about white supremacy, but there are no systems out there that are presented in a way that the majority of people know about them and can access them, that are designed to heal the broken relationship that we have with ourselves, with our parents, and with the motherland. And until that work is done, I think that we will just dysfunction as a group. And we are such a powerful people, because I don't know any other group of people that could have survived what we have. I mean, it's just amazing to me. It's just something in our DNA, and it's the determination, I'm sure, of our ancestors, that because we are the children of the children of the children that just would not die. Now, there's another piece, too. Black grits, coconut water, and salsa. First of all, black grits stands for Black Girls Raised in the South. That's what grits is girls raised in the South. And I call this black grits. Coconut water represents the Caribbean sisters that were in this group. And salsa represents the Spanish-speaking sisters in the group. We also had a sister from Nigeria. She's an Igbo woman in the group as well. So I named the group Black Grits, Coconut Water, and Salsa. And the combination of our stories led to the writing, as I said before, of these mommy letters. Sometimes people want to say mommy's letters. No, these are letters to mommy. These are mommy letters. And they depicted the stories of our lives and our experiences with our mothers and our fathers and other people in our lives that were loving and constructive or not loving and destructive. So there's a whole series of these mommy letters that we have gone over all throughout the state performing, doing these readings. We've been on television, we've been on radio shows, and we're asked to do these performances, particularly around Mother's Day, during violence against women and children, that period of time, Women's History Month. But this is a powerful, powerful experience. And each time we do it, we're just amazed at the number of men and women, because we have a Q&A session, a question and answer session after the performances. And people are just lined up wanting to talk to each of us because one of our stories or some of our stories resonate with people. So the ones that might have had incestuous experiences as children or physical violence in the household or a mentally ill mother, they will come to us based on the letters that we read and talk about their experiences and ours. And so many people with tears. I remember us doing a performance at the Kennedy Center at 134th Street between 5th and Lenox. And we had 250-some people in that gymnasium. And so many of the people were older women and men. And those women, after it was over, talked about how liberating it was for them to hear us tell these stories, because some of them said they had never talked about things that had happened to them, especially the sexual abuse. I'm talking about 90-year-old, 88-year-old women who never talked about the sexual abuse that went on in their homes, in the churches. I mean, it's just, and so they haven't healed, but these women reared daughters and sons, who reared daughters and sons, who reared daughters and sons. And the point I'm making is that
it's a
that
cycle.
Intergenerational, yes, because they reared them based on their own experiences and understanding, and it wasn't necessarily always healthy. And to not talk about your abuse is to protect your abuser, and that is not healthy, because that leaves that abuser free to continue to ravage and pillage throughout communities and families. I have a girlfriend whose brother not only raped her and all her sisters, but two of the brothers as well. When the mother was told, the mother told her, don't tell the father because the father is going to kill him, so don't tell. So we live these conspiracies of silence that are so toxic that without the healing taking place, we will continue to perpetuate the same dysfunction. And that's what we see so much of. When I look at little boys and girls coming home from school acting out, I can almost tell you exactly what's going on in their households. When I see these little girls who were so inappropriate, their behavior so sexualized, I can almost guarantee you that something inappropriate has happened to them or they have witnessed it. Remember when I worked in Brooklyn once, I was going to the office, and there was this young black man who was raving in the street, talking to an imaginary little boy and telling him what position he had better assume. And didn't I tell you not to come in this room while I'm effing your mother? Oh, you want to see what I'm doing to her? Well, get your A over there. I'm going to show you what it feels like. And he went through this entire rape situation verbally, standing there at the subway, and I had to stop and listen to him because I wanted to write about this. And I said, this is just the most heartbreaking thing, because I'm positive he has hurt some little boys, at least. But I'm positive that this is what happened to him. And he watched his mother being brutalized, and there was nothing he could do about it. So when I see young men who beat women, I think about how enraged they are when they were little boys and they had to stand by helplessly and watch their mothers being beaten and brutalized. But their anger toward their mother, they could not take it out on the father or whoever the male was. So they took it out on the representative of the victim, their mother was the victim. So what do? They transfer those feelings, that rage, onto other women because they hated their mother's powerlessness as much as they hated their own. So now they're abusers. And they teach the little children in those households to be abusers. And then you have women that are so needy and want to be loved so badly that they meet people that they just met. The next thing you know, they're living in their households, doing God only knows what to their children and them too. And so these serial unhealthy relationships just continue. And I watch women walk down the street dressed in the most absurd way, and they don't see anything wrong with it because I'm old school, so this is new school. But they don't even think about the messages they're giving to their daughters and how the way we dress also has something to do with how we are viewed as sexual beings. So when you see little girls with their stomachs out and this lipstick on or this lip gloss that might as well be lipstick because it has colors, and their hair done in styles that were not the styles that little girls wore when I was growing up. I see little girls in heels, high heel shoes, and they make them and sell them, and you see them in our community. I don't see them downtown, little girls whose little ankles haven't completely developed in these wedge heel shoes that we put on our children. So when I see little girls at 5 and 4, and their mothers are standing with their girlfriends on the corner and encouraging the little girls to dance and drop it like it's hot, and I'm watching grown men look at the little girls drop it while it's hot, and I'm looking at these little girls' bodies that are overdeveloped because they've been brought up on Kentucky Fried and McDonald's, which is full of nothing but growth hormones and GMOs, so they have breasts and they have behinds that look like adults. And so they're dressed and behaving like adults. So it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to understand why unhealthy men would see nothing wrong with approaching a little girl or having a sexual experience with her or just raping her. There's just so much pathology that I see. And the thing that keeps me hopeful is the good that I see and the love that I see among our people and the hope. I see all of us have not lost hope. I have not lost hope. And I will continue to do this work until the day I no longer exist on this plane this way, and then I'll do it again in another form. It's necessary work, healing the broken relationship.
And one of the some of the examples of the hope that you speak of comes through or is presented through these mommy letters, which I understand you have several here.
Well, I have a couple of letters here that talk about, one of them has to do with the love of a daughter for her mother and the despair and the helplessness and fear that gripped her. Another one has to do with family violence. So I'm not going to read the entire letters, but I'll just give you some snippets from
Please.
A couple of them. This letter here, I don't want to give away the whole story, but maybe if I read some of it, people might get an idea of what it's about.
Sure.
But it says, "Dear Mommy, I was just thinking, it's amazing that we don't know how much we love someone until we think we've lost them. I remember that moment when I realized I'd taken you for granted. But this particular morning was unlike any other before or after that. I remember waking, sitting straight up in the bed as though someone had jerked me out of my sleep. I couldn't breathe. My heart felt as though it had stopped beating. I thought I was suffocating. I didn't know what to think. I didn't think, really. I got out of bed like a robot, but this robot had feelings. I felt a terror that gripped me, something I've not felt since. I knew something had to be wrong, dreadfully wrong. I couldn't hear any sounds, no birds singing, no kids playing. I didn't smell anything cooking either. That's when I knew for sure something had to be wrong. I went into your room, slowly, afraid, filled with both terror and dread, but it was something I knew I had to do. I didn't know why, but you had done your job well. You taught me to listen to my feelings, and they were trying to tell me something. So I kept walking over to your bed. Don't ask me why, I just kept moving. I looked in, and I saw your shape under the sheets. You weren't moving. And I said, Mommy, Mommy? Mommy? Mommy! Oh, Mommy! Oh, Mommy! I heard the screams, yet I didn't know who was screaming. Everything went black. The world stopped. I shook you, you didn't move. I shook you some more, you still didn't move. That's when I started praying. Oh God, please don't let my mother be dead. Please, you can't. What'll happen to me? Where is everybody anyway? I remember running out the house as fast as I could. I heard the screen door slam shut. I never felt my feet hit the ground. I ran next door screaming, Mommy's dead! Mommy's dead! Oh God, Mommy's dead! Call the ambulance! Oh God, please call the ambulance! Time passed. It seemed like an eternity. Finally the ambulance came, and I remember the white men in their white coats telling me I couldn't go to the hospital with you. I wasn't 12. Remember, Mommy, back then you had to be 12 years old in order to visit somebody in the hospital? That's when all hell broke loose. I remember screaming and fighting and kicking and scratching and climbing my way into the back of that ambulance. I didn't care what anybody said. They'd have to kill me. You weren't going to leave without me. And where was Daddy and everybody else anyway? Well, I didn't need them. You were my mother, and I'd die before I let you go without me. All I knew was they said you were dead and had gone to a better place. The old lady said you'd gone to a better place and you'd gone to heaven. Well, if you had to die to get there, I didn't want you to go, and I didn't care if I went to hell for thinking that way. After a while, I just stopped crying and started praying. God, please don't let my mother be dead. Please, please, I'll do anything you say. I'll be good. I promise, I promise. Just don't let her be dead. I decided you weren't dead. I refused to believe it, even though the white men in their white coats and everybody else said you were. So I'll stop there. So that's one of the Mommy letters.
And again, this is written by one of your clients, or former client.
That was one of the letters that I wrote.
You wrote?
Yes, that was a letter that I wrote about my mother's dying situation. Now this one is about another situation that happened in my household. Dear Mommy, I wish you knew how I feel. I know how you feel. You're sad all the time. You're scared all the time. All you do is sit, looking out the window, humming all those songs that nobody knows. I guess you make them up, I don't know. I guess you're religious too, 'cause you love to hum all those Negro spirituals. Oh Lord, here comes Daddy. I wonder what mood he's in today. Thank God he doesn't look mad. He looks like he's in a hurry. Happy even. Well, I don't know what's wrong with me. It's Friday. I know what to expect. And you, oh Lord, there you go again. Head hung down, looking like you're going to cry. What's the matter with you? You ought to be mad. You know he's going to do what he always does. Come in the house, finding fault with what everybody didn't do, especially you. Get dressed, go out and stay until early Monday morning, unless he wins, of course. Then he'll come home, give you some money for food, leave, lose, come home again, and everybody'd better watch out if he was broke and you had spent the money. And another thing, how do you feel when he says you've been out whoring around and that's why you didn't do whatever it was he thought you should do? You know you never go anywhere. And when you go out to do day's work, you sneak, 'cause he'll beat your brains out if he found out you had a job and made some money. That's why I always want to go with you, so you can hurry up and get home before he comes back. I'll never forget the first day I went with you. I couldn't believe it. How could one human being clean a house that big in one day? Well, I also know why I've never, and I'll never have marble floors. The only way I could scrub them down there on my knees with that cheesecloth was knowing that if I did it, you wouldn't have to. But look at you running around like a chicken with his head cut off. Sam, do you want something to eat? Well, I'll heat it up. I didn't know what time you'd get home. Don't do that. Don't do that. Stop. Don't do that. Stop in front. You don't do that in front of the children. and you smiling as he feels your behind. Have you gone crazy, Mommy? Why are you smiling? Why don't you take that frying pan and knock him in the head? And by the way, I wonder who that woman is sitting out there in the car. Don't you want to know? Say something, damn it. Are you going to be treated like an old shoe all your life? I know I won't. And again, I'll stop there.
And these are actual performances, is that correct?
Yes. It's a 2-hour performance with an intermission.
And when are you slated to do the next one?
Well, what I'm doing now is setting up new performances. I have some inquiries from a couple of the universities. And what I'm finding, too, is a lot of the churches, the faith-based groups, they want these, too. And that's profound because that is a group that historically has not wanted to talk about these things. Particularly the First Lady, she doesn't want to talk about her sexual abuse and the violence in her household, nor the violence that sometimes is going on in her household married to the minister that she's there supporting every Sunday. And the sad thing is, with people in the churches who have not dealt with these issues, when women come to them with these issues, they're not able to help them either. They will encourage them to pray. They'll have prayer services, and they will encourage them, let them know that, we don't understand things, as, in God's time, it's not our time. There are all these, what I call cliches, that don't help the situation. But I'm finding that, like in the case of Mary, Kelly Price, there are women who talk about the abuse that they have experienced and who have left those abusive relationships, some of them, which gives other women and men, because women are not the only ones that are abused. There are women that abuse their husbands. There are women that rape their children and other people's children. So I don't want you to think that these mommy letters are just about the dysfunction in households that are perpetrated by women or that are allowed to occur by women, because there's a whole series of these mommy letters. This is mommy letters and women. There's a mommy letters and men.
I see. Okay.
Yes. There's a mommy letters and persons with disabilities, because that's another thing. I work with women and men who have disabilities, and the horror stories they have to tell are just unbelievable. One young woman I work with, she's in a wheelchair, and she's had MS since she was a child. And she was impregnated at 15 by her mother's so-called husband, and she contracted AIDS. So she now, of course, has full-blown AIDS, and she was confined to a wheelchair all her life. And it was not until I started working with her that she talked about the real backstory of how this came about. I mean, there's just some stories out there that need to be told, and all of them are not ugly stories, because these mommy letters are not, women go through and the men go through, because men are writing mommy letters as well. And I run groups with men as well as women. But the mommy letter process, the uncovering process, is the process that results in the kind of letters that I just read. The pain and the anguish. When we're uncovering a lot of stuff that's unconscious, because once you start writing, stuff just flows. And the next thing you know, you've got something here that you didn't even know because you weren't trying to produce it. It just takes on a life of its own. But I have people write from the ages of 0 to 5, from 6 to 12, and from 13 to 18. And then they write from the perspective of being an adult. And what you will see is a progression in the letters. And as we do our clinical work, you'll see a difference and a change in the tenor of the letters. And so letters go from pain and anger and despair to hope and beauty and forgiveness, because forgiveness is a necessary part of the healing process. Because until you're able to forgive, then you're stuck in prison with your perpetrator. That person still has power over you. I do a lot of work around Don Miguel Ruiz, his work, The Four Agreements. And when people learn how to live that way, being impeccable with your word, not saying things, not using words that are destructive and harmful to others as well as yourself. When you find yourself being disappointed in yourself, don't denigrate yourself and say, oh, that was so stupid of me. I must be crazy. That's not being impeccable with your word. And those words sort of deposited inside your psyche and your spirit. So you keep hearing yourself being called stupid enough, at some level you're going to feel that way. You're going to buy into that. So I have to teach women and men how to read language as well. Not making assumptions is a biggie. That's just another one of the 4 agreements that I teach people, that he teaches and he taught me. Because when you make assumptions without validating if it's true or not, you get yourself in serious trouble. So a lot of times people don't tell because they think that people are going to talk about them. They think that people are going to see them as horrible people, or they don't want people to see their mother a certain way.
That they may have, in fact, in some way been responsible for what happened to them.
Absolutely, because children absolutely believe somehow that it's their fault. That's where the shame comes in. So this work is an ongoing process for me. And it's, as I said before, it's a necessary piece of work. For example, there's a piece of a letter someone had written, and she did give me permission to publicize some of her work. I'll just grab a piece out of it.
Okay.
And because she's having this conversation about her experience and her talking to her mother, and she says, I'll just pick up from here. 6 months later, and many mornings after, Mommy, I don't feel good. I can't stop throwing up. I feel sick. What's wrong with you, girl? When you had your last period? Huh? Huh, nothing. When you had your last period? I don't know. Well, if you're pregnant again, you're going to have this baby. Who's the father? Huh? Huh, nothing. Who's the father? William. Well, you better let him know. So I found William and told him I was pregnant, and he laughed at me. Pregnant? How far gone are you? 6 months. You crazy girl. We only did it one time. How could you be pregnant now? That was a good question. I didn't know what to tell him. I didn't have an answer. But anyway, there was one thing I did know. I was a good little girl, but Mommy didn't know Daddy. This is a woman who was repeatedly raped by her father, who was a police officer, by the way. And she had repeated abortions. And this last one, her mother told her, you're going to keep this baby. And her daughter is her sister. Her daughter is a grown woman now, and her mother still refuses to believe that the father did these things. She thinks that her daughter's just sick and crazy and was jealous of her relationship with her father. That's why she told these lies. So this is a woman who lived all of her life impacted by this broken relationship with her mother, and how she had to feel about herself and the conflict she had to have felt about her daughter, who was her sister. So
she's suffering on a number of levels.
Yes, absolutely. It's just a lot of work that we need to do. And this is work that, as I said before, I'm dedicated to doing. And I'm just so happy to have gotten an opportunity to talk about this here right before Mother's Day, because maybe this can be a gift that mothers can give themselves and daughters can give themselves, and they can give their daughters the gift of a voice. Because as long as we remain silent, we suffer. And unhealed wounds stink. They really do. They ooze. You can always tell if a wound is not healed. And all of that impacts other people, all the healing that we don't get. We just continue, the legacy will continue. And I want to see that legacy end, that ancestral inheritance of rage, the ancestral inheritance of abuse. Because I do believe that the ancestors have given us these memories for us to heal so that they can rest I don't think that they will rest until we heal, then they'll be healed. So I believe that a lot of us live these experiences not to diminish by any means the impact of slavery and white supremacy, which still reigns. But there's another side to that, a side to that requires that we take responsibility for our destiny and our lives in spite of what has happened to us.
For those who may be interested in seeking more information about the Mommie Letters series, how can they go about contacting you or obtaining more information?
I have a website. It's called thebonnieharrison.com, but I'll give you my email address, and that's Bonnie, this is all lowercase, BONNIE, NYC65 at yahoo.com. Send your emails, and I'll review the material, and I will respond to you quickly.
It's certainly been a pleasure having you on this show, Professor Harrison. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me again. Thank you.
That's going to do it for this edition of the G-Man Interviews. I'm the G-Man, and I thank you for joining me. Until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.